Now, I wish to introduce our next speaker, Cecil Phillip, Senior Cloud Advocate at Microsoft. Welcome, Cecil.
Hi, everybody. How you doing?
Hi, how are you?
Good. So
Nice.
thank you all for joining me. Thank you all for having me here. I really appreciate it. Should I just go ahead? You want me to go ahead and get to it?
Yes, let's make it. Stage.
Awesome. Thank you so much again. So, kind of like they said, my name is Cecil Phillip. I am a senior cloud advocate at Microsoft, and that really just means I spend a lot of my time working with developers like you, speaking to customers and students and different types of folks to try and understand like what are some of their pain points in terms of building software, in terms of using our cloud, and in terms of really just getting work done. Now, for the next 40 minutes or so, the session I want to talk to you all about today is how we could use a tool called Dapr to make microservices a little bit easier for you. So why don't we get to it? Right? So when we think about how developers build applications today, a lot of folks are moving forward to do more of a microservice type architecture. So today we're very familiar with having a single website and a single database, and maybe you talk to a caching server, and very typical structure. But as we move forward and we want to start leveraging these tools like cloud native tools and distributed system tools and containers and all this types of stuff, well, there's a lot more that developers really have to think about, right? You have to think about, well, does the tool chain that I have right now have support for a lot of these different things that I want to add to it? Do I have to change programming languages? Or, how do I have to look at my architecture? How do I have to look at my infrastructure? Am I going to have to use different hardware, or how different does the layout of my system look like? Right? There's a lot that you really have to think about as we start to move from the world that we're used to into this distributed systems microservice space, so that we can really take advantage of that scale. So what are some of the things that really hold developers back, in our opinion, from doing some of these things? And like I mentioned before, you have to think about, well, what exactly are the things that I need to use, right? How rich are the tools within that ecosystem? So for instance, I might have like a Python app or a .NET app or a Java app. And, maybe one might have better support for, the logging framework I want to use. One might have better support for open telemetry. Maybe I want to use other things like secrets and publish subscribe and all these different types of things. And, based on the ecosystem, based on the community, I might have advantages of using one language versus another, or one operating system versus another. What if I want to host my stuff on premise? What if I want to host it in the cloud? What if I want to do both and have something of a hybrid model? Right? All these things are things that we have to really start to think about as we start to build these microservice type of applications. And so this is kind of where Dapr comes into play. So Dapr is our tool that we introduced to the world about 2 years ago at Microsoft Ignite 2019, and it recently just went to 1.0. But Dapr actually stands for Distributed Application Runtime, and it's essentially a really cool, interesting tool that you could use to make building microservices easier by leveraging some of those built-in facilities and those built-in functionalities that are inside of Dapr itself. And obviously, I'll talk to you about those as we continue to go forward. So what are some of the goals of Dapr, right? Again, if you remember like some of those issues that we spoke about earlier, right? I have to look at some of the different programming languages that some of these different tool chains support, right? I have to think about, well, how can I have like a consistent portable runtime that I could have go between cloud, between on-premise, and maybe even being able to use both, right? Dapr even allows us to have like adopt some of those basic standards that we might be familiar with. So, any app that can speak HTTP or gRPC, any app that can, make a web request call, can essentially use Dapr and leverage some of those components that it has inside of it. And the great thing about it is that it's really platform agnostic. So again, it doesn't matter on what operating system you want to run on, if you want to run in Kubernetes or not, do you want to run in the cloud or not. You can make use of, again, some of those common building blocks that the Dapr team has kind of extracted out for you to make use of inside of your applications today. And one of the things that we've noticed is that when developers don't have to think about some of those additional components as much, then it makes it a little bit easier for them to get their work done. Now, you might be saying, okay, Cecil, what are all these components? What does it actually do? Like, what are the things that Dapr actually gives me? And I mean, that's a good question. So If we look at what the building blocks of Dapr are, they're essentially a collection of concerns that the team looked at, from customers, from our own applications inside of Microsoft, to determine, well, these are the things that most folks that are building distributed applications, cloud native, microservice applications really care about, right? And they include things like service discovery, like how do I figure out, what are the different services that are available within my infrastructure? How can I do things like publish, subscribe, or how can I make use of like an actor framework, or do distributed tracing and logging so I can know how messages are flowing in and out of my application. Now, one of the things that you also notice that we try to do with Dapr is not only do we expose some of these common building blocks that address some of these different concerns, but we also try to make it very platform agnostic, very programming language agnostic. So, Dapr as it stands today will allow you to use any programming language that you're using today. So, benefit of that is that, well, if you're using .NET today, if you're using Java today, if you're using Python today, that means that you don't have to change or rewrite your code to suit the framework. Right? You can just use whatever you're doing today, and you can even build on top of that as well. We actually have a lot of folks that use Dapr with a variety of programming languages, and it's a really great integration point. I remember a long time ago when I actually used to work in a stock trading company. And one of the things that we did was, the company is essentially made up of a bunch of other smaller companies. And, over time and over acquisitions, each one of these companies had their own IT and their own development teams. And when you're in a situation like that, that means that, well, your infrastructure now is made up of some folks that are writing Java and some folks that are writing PHP and Ruby and .NET. And so there was a lot of different things that are there. And back then we had to write a lot of plumbing code just to allow those services to know where the other one is, to expose their functionality, and then obviously we had to be able to continually enhance them and test them as well. So again, the great thing about Dapr and making use of it as a part of your microservice strategy is just the fact that one, I get some of these common building blocks out of the box that I don't really have to think too much about how do I set these things up. And two, I could keep using the code that I'm using today, right? So I don't have to switch programming languages or switch frameworks or change how I think about building the actual business logic of my application to make use of some of these additional microservice components that are here. So let's take a look and see how exactly Dapr kind of works. And it uses a concept known as a sidecar. So if some of you may or may not be familiar with a sidecar is, it's essentially, consider your application, right? Like these little gray boxes that you're looking at on the screen right now represent your application. And Dapr runs as a separate process right next to your application. So again, imagine I have a web API or a service that's processing queues, messages off of a queue, right? Or maybe I have like a website service or something like that. Next to each of those, or next to each instance of those, we'll have what's called a sidecar, which is just a separate process that's going to be there for your application to communicate to. So again, if you remember some of those building blocks I said that Dapr provides, right? Like pub sub, and it provides service discovery and logging and all of these types of things. So now when my application needs to be able to send a pub sub message, or it needs to call a service that might exist on in another application or another microprocess somewhere else in my infrastructure, I don't have to worry about configuring this thing and setting up security and doing a lot of these types of gymnastics that we usually have to do. I could really rely on the Dapr sidecar to kind of figure some of that stuff out for me. So as you see here, my application A and application B, or service A and service B, they only speak directly to that Dapr sidecar. And now the Dapr sidecar, through configuration and DNS and some other things, it'll be able to know, well, what are some of the services that are configured on the system? What are some of those building blocks that are available for me to use? And then also, how can I enable that secure communication throughout my ecosystem and throughout my application without my developer having to think too much about it? So as you can see here, for instance, if I wanted to use like a state store, for instance, I could use things like Redis or Cosmos DB. If I wanted to do PubSub, I could do RabbitMQ, ActiveMQ. I could use Azure Service Bus in the cloud if I wanted to. And one of the benefits of this is that, again, your application doesn't need to know anything about the specific implementation. All it needs to know is, hey, Dapr understands HTTP or gRPC. I could talk to Dapr And I could say, hey, Dapr, do you have a state store? If you do, store this information for me. Or hey, Dapr, do you have a service that can invoke this method? Here you go. Here's a message, or here's an HTTP request. Could you forward that along for me? And Dapr will take care of the service discovery. It'll take care of, again, making sure that you have permissions to call that other service. And it'll take care of things like tracing and logging and some of these other types of things. Okay. And again, like I mentioned before, not only does Dapr provide these additional building blocks that we can work on, we can use any code that we want, and then we also run on any cloud that we want to. So, of course, I work on Microsoft, and this is an open source project that's come out of the company. But, we have customers that are using it that are internal, folks that are using it on, with Alibaba, with, on Kubernetes, on Docker, just different clouds and different infrastructures. So I think that's pretty great. All right, so I've mentioned or teased a little bit about these building blocks and what they are. Why don't we spend a little bit of time just to really dive into these building blocks and understand like what they do and then how exactly we can start integrating these things into our application. And I think I want to get started with the service invocation. So with service invocation, we essentially are using some of the components of Dapr to figure out, well, what are the other services that I could call? And when I say services, I'm talking about either a gRPC service or web API, right? What are some of these other services that I could call? And then, how can I get to them and how can I have Dapr, figure that out, right? So it's essentially doing service discovery. And as you can see here, Dapr has a very much of a well-defined contract as we start to make use of some of these building blocks. So on the top line, you see, hey, I want to post a message from my front end to my shopping cart on the back end, right? And I want to say, hey, I want you to get me information for John Doe, and like here's his shopping cart. And notice how the contract, right? Like look at how the URL is shaped, right? It says invoke/cart, right? And then the method I want to invoke on that cart is checkout, right? And I'm passing in that additional JSON information within the body. And now Dapr, I'm going to just talk to my Dapr sidecar. And my Dapr sidecar is always going to be on localhost, which is another good thing too. I don't have to think too much about how do I find the Dapr sidecar, right? Like the whole point is the Dapr sidecar and your process is supposed to be like right next to each other on the same box or on the same node. So I make that request, and then those different instances of Dapr will figure out what each other are, right? Like they use a technology known as MDNS, right? And using MDNS, it'll be able to figure out where these things happen to be, and then I'm able to forward on that message to the cart, and then have it come back, and I can get the response back inside of my front end. Now, another one that we make use of a lot is the state management. All right, so you can think about, hey, you have a lot of these services within your architecture, and I need to be able to store states, right? So again, we were just talking about a shopping cart, right? Imagine as I'm adding things to my shopping cart, I want to start storing like what items did I put in the cart and how many of them are there, or maybe I want to run like a count or a voting system or something like that, right? Like we could use a state store to do that. But again, because we're using Dapr, my application doesn't need to have any implementation-specific packages or any implementation-specific logic to be able to work with these. So, from the perspective of my code, all I need to do is say, hey, Dapr, store this for me. Hey, Dapr, retrieve this for me. Hey, Dapr, do you have these keys or not? And then in the backend, the implementation will be configured inside of Dapr. And so, again, that implementation could be in Redis. It could be in Cosmos DB or Cassandra or any of our open source providers that we have. And you can even create your own too if you wanted to. But again, I want you to pay attention to URL, right? The URL, if you notice, again, is using a very well-defined contract for Dapr. So on that port on localhost, I'm saying I'm going to make a post call for the state store, and then I'm going to put this information into the state. And then whenever I'm able to retrieve it, I can make a GET request for the state store and the name of that key, right? The key of that thing that I wanted to store, and I can pull it back inside of my application. All right, so I think I've been talking for a little bit. How about we see a demo so you can see how some of these pieces kind of plug together and how they work. So the first thing I want to do is I'm going to head over to the browser. And inside of my web browser, I have an application that I already built and it's running right now. And this is our Contoso Crafts application that we usually use whenever we want to demo new features and stuff. But this is a fairly straightforward application. As you can see, it's almost like a storefront. So I could scroll through and I could see some of the different products that are available within the store, right? I can click and I can get information about these different items. I can see the pictures, I can see the rating, I could do scoring and all these types of things. I can add items to the cart. Notice I can click through here. And then notice as I add items to the cart, this number here is increasing, right? So yeah, I can click through and I could, say I want to add t-shirts or a book or something like that, right? And as my shopping cart continues to be populated, I can click on this and notice I can see all my items and then I can hit submit. And then, some process in the background is going to go ahead and process these items. Now, it's a fairly straightforward application, but let me tell you the components or the pieces that actually make this up. Right, and we have three main pieces. So one, we have the front end, and the front end is being built with Blazor. So if you all are familiar, maybe not familiar with Blazor, it's one of the newer technologies that we've released over the couple of years that allow you to write applications using WebAssembly and components. It's a really nice programming model for building web applications. So that's what the front end is built out of. Then next to the front end, I also have a web API. And my web API is just returning products, and those products are being stored in a MongoDB database. And then lastly, I have a checkout processor. So every time, if you remember, when I added something to the cart and I hit submit, I have a thing in the background that's listening for checkout messages on a queue. And it's going to say, hey, whenever a message pops in that queue, I'm going to pull it out and I'm going to start processing those messages. Okay, so why don't we take a look and see what the code for this actually looks like and how we can configure Dapr to make some of these parts work. So I'm going to head over to Visual Studio Code. And first thing I want to show you, I'm going to take a look at the website first. First thing I want you to realize is that when I open my CS project, right, and the CS project is where I list all my dependencies and NuGet packages and things of that nature. I want you to see there's nothing in here that says anything about one Dapr, but also there's nothing in here that talks about Redis or messaging queues or anything of the sort. It's essentially just a regular, it's essentially just a regular application, right? But again, because I'm making use of those standard protocols like HTTP, I can still communicate with my Dapr sidecar without having to do any additional stuff unnecessarily. Now, let me show you my startup.cs file. And again, if you all are unfamiliar with the startup.cs file, this is kind of where we come to configure the configuration or the booting up, like how does our application start up? And what you see here, I'm going to highlight these lines here on line 23 or 27. You can see that what I'm doing is I'm adding an HTTP client, and for the base address, I'm using localhost 3500. And I'm using that localhost 3500 specifically because, well, that's where my Dapr sidecar is running, right? And so regardless of whether I'm running it in dev mode or if I'm running it in production, that shouldn't have to change. I should always be speaking to my Dapr sidecar on localhost. All right. So now that I have that set up and I know what the address is of my Dapr sidecar, how do I actually make use of it? And what I'm going to click on is inside of my Dapr product service. So using the Dapr, using that HTTP client that I just set up, I'm going to make use of the HTTP factory. Again, this is a .NET thing, so essentially just allows me to make these .NET requests without having to constantly create a new instance of HTTP client. But you can see all I'm doing here is I'm going to take the client, I'm going to prepare my payload, and then I'm going to use that well-defined URL that I showed some of you a little bit in those slides, right? So I want to invoke the web API, right? So invoke the products API, and I want you to call the method products, right? So essentially I'm saying, hey, I want you to take this information, I want you to update those products. And updating might be, I might want to give it a rating or something like that. If I look inside of my get products one, I also have one where I'm making an HTTP GET request. And I want to, again, just like before, I want to invoke the products API. And I want you to invoke the method products, right? And that's it, right? But again, remember, I'm calling that on localhost inside of my application. I don't know where, I actually don't know if the products API even exists. I don't know where it is. I don't know how many instances of it actually lives in my ecosystem. The only thing I know is that I have a sidecar and Dapr understands this thing. It's going to be able to figure it out for me. All right. Now, let me show you. So now that we've seen that, I'll even show you the web API really quickly. So you can also see that there's really nothing special inside of it. Inside of the web API, I have this one dependency on MongoDB because, like I told you before, I'm using MongoDB to store some of that information. But other than that, like there's nothing else really special in here. It doesn't know about Redis. It doesn't know about RabbitMQ or messaging things. All it knows about is sending information back and forth to Dapr. Okay. Now, so if I have these plain old applications, how exactly do I set this up to work with Dapr? And so I'm going to show you what my Docker Compose looks like. So I'm just using Docker Compose to run this locally, but again, you can run these on Kubernetes or anything of the sort. But if you remember what I said before, every time I have an application or every instance of my thing that I have to have an associated sidecar. So I'm going to collapse some of these things and we'll walk through them one at a time, right? So I have three parts of my app, right? I have the website, I have the products API, I have the checkout processor. So again, I'm building, this is nothing really in here is important. I'm building a Docker container for my website. But then along with my website, I have my Dapr sidecar, right? And then here's this command that it's going to go ahead and initialize my Dapr sidecar, right? I have my products API, again, same thing, right? Products API on a Docker file. And then I have the associated sidecar, right? My Dapr sidecar. And again, so on and so forth, right? Like checkout processor sidecar, right? Like for every instance of the thing, like I have to have an associated instance of that sidecar. Now, a couple of things I want you to pay attention to inside of the configuration, and that is Dapr-D, as you see here, is what I'm using to start up the sidecar, right? That's the process that we're actually going to run. And then I have to give it an application ID. So this one is the checkout processor. Again, we have also the products API as well as the website. And then the next thing I need to do is let it know what port is my application listening on. So what port do I need to speak to? All of my things are listening on port 80, so that's fine, but you can change that if you need to. And I also need to give it the path to the configuration file, right? And then my configuration files are how I'm going to tell Dapr, well, what state stores do I have configured? What pub sub things do I have configured? How do I do tracing and all these other types of things? And so let's take a look and see what that actually looks like really quick. And I'm just going to take a quick look at these. We're going to continue to dive through them as we go on. Now, for instance, if we want to take a look here, so this is an example of like one of my Dapr configuration files. And this one is just setting up distributed tracing. So as you can see here, I'm setting it up to talk to Zipkin, right? And I'll show you my Zipkin thing a little bit later on. I also have other things in here for RabbitMQ, as you can see here, and I also have one here for Redis. Now, if you look at this YAML file, you might notice it looks very much like a Kubernetes. It has a very similar structure to Kubernetes manifest files or component files, and I think that's done by on purpose. So whenever you're deploying your application, whether you're running it locally for dev, you use these same YAML files. If you're deploying it to your VMs or whatever your production scenario is, you use these same YAML files. And when you're deploying them to Kubernetes, again, you can use kubectl apply or whatever the case is, and you could use these same configuration files. So I think it's really great that regardless of whatever or wherever you're hosting some of these things, you could still make use of that. Now, like I mentioned before, like I am using Redis to configure a state store. So Redis is where I'm actually storing that information. And this is what the configuration for that state store looks like. So notice I have some metadata. I gave my state store name and the default namespace. I have to give it a type. So the type is states.redis. And I know this because this is just straight out of the documentation. And then inside of here, notice I'm giving it some configuration values, right? I'm saying where's the Redis host? And because I'm running in Docker Compose, I'm just giving it, Redis service and the name of the port. And then I also have a password. One of the great things here that you see is that notice I don't have that password hard-coded inside of my configuration file. My password is actually coming from a secret store. And I'll show you how to get information in and out of a secret store as we go on. But the important part to note here is, again, I'm going to keep saying this over and over again, my app knows nothing about Redis. It really doesn't. All it knows about is Dapr. And all it's going to say is, hey, Dapr, could you store these things for me? And it's going to pull that information back on. So again, as I went in here and I added stuff to my cart, every time I added something to my cart, my website is going to make a call to Dapr to add something to the state store. And if I come in here to my Redis instance, if I refresh it, and I click on here, I could see some of my information that I'm storing in Redis. Again, I can come back in here and I can add some more information to it. I'll click some more of these things, right? And I'll come, oh, sorry, wrong button. Wrong button, right. Oh, I need to make this thing go away. Go away, go. Right, so as I click on some of these buttons and I refresh this, there you go. You see, again, it's going to continue to populate that for me. And all I need to know is, okay, well, where's Dapr? How does Dapr handle that? Okay, so that was the demo. So that was state storage and also service discovery. So let's go on and talk about some of the other things Dapr can do. Now, one of my favorite things, and I mentioned this a little bit just a little while ago, is that Dapr has really good support for observability. So observability meaning metrics and tracing and those types of things. And in the early stages of Dapr, they actually made use of a thing called open census. And some of you might have heard about it before, right? It was an industry neutral way of being able to collect some of this type of information. And I think since then, open census has moved forward and it's now become open telemetry. But now using things like, relying on these standards like open census and open telemetry, Dapr is able to plug in a lot of these additional providers that you see here on the right-hand side. So again, my application doesn't need to know about Zipkin or Jaeger or Prometheus or even Azure Monitor for running inside of the cloud. It's, Dapr just does it for me, which is great. And again, my app just needs to focus on building and, curating and working on that business logic, and everything else kind of just gets handled for me. And all I have to do is configure it one time inside of my Dapr cycle. And so this is something, an example, for instance, if y'all have never seen Prometheus or Jaeger before, this is essentially what you get, right? Like I have the ability to see where is my information flowing to, right? Like I'm calling from this instance to that instance or from this service to that service, and how many of them do I have inside my architecture and stuff like that. So I think that's really cool. All right. Again, like I also mentioned before, we also have the ability to do publish and subscribe. Like that's another fairly common integration point and pattern a lot of folks want to do whenever they're building microservices. Right, with publish subscribe, again, I have a sender and a receiver, and then they don't know about each other, and then we rely on that intermediary, right? We rely on that message broker in the middle to kind of manage the routing, like the storage and the routing of those messages that get sent into the queue. But again, like we have a lot of options there, right? Like we have ActiveMQ and we have NATS and we have Azure Service Bus and Kafka, tons of other things. How do I choose which one do I want to use? How do I pick? And then what if I want to switch out and use a different one? Do I have to rewrite my code again just to make use of certain facility in a different thing? And luckily we don't have to, right? Because Dapr does that, right? Dapr will do that for us, which is a great thing. And again, like all we need to do is once I have my app that could speak HTTP or gRPC, I could just use that well-defined URL and make requests to it. So here I can make a request to /publish, and all I have to do is give it the data and the topic, right? The topic being like, the thing that I actually want to subscribe to. And then I just have to send it to Dapr, and Dapr will figure out what storage mechanism or what broker I'm going to put it into. And again, you can see at the other side, I'll have an associated Dapr cycle that will be listening for some of that information, and then it's going to pull it in, and my application will be able to start processing it. One of the newer features that has come out in Dapr is the ability to be able to do bindings, and that's both input and output bindings. So if you're familiar with Azure Functions and just serverless architectures in general, a lot of the times that there's going to be some trigger, right? Is there going to be some trigger or signal that's going to tell your code, hey, I want you to start running now. And usually something that's, in absence of user intervention. So what happens if someone updates a key or inserts a record or sends a new message, right? Like I want to kick off some workflow, I want to do something. And so Dapr has the ability to tie into some of these components using input bindings. And again, as you would expect, all that I need to do is inside of my application, I'll have some, web-related method that'll be able to listen on an endpoint on a URL using HTTP or gRPC, and then I'll just be able to get that message, and Dapr will be the one that's going to monitor those items and send that information over to me, which I think is great. Okay, so let's take a look now. Let's head back over to VS and see how we could set up PubSub and also distributed tracing. So I'm going to go back to, I'm going to go back over to Visual Studio Code. And again, I want to show you like how these things are configured and how they actually happen. So when I'm ready, when I'm ready to actually check out, right? When I'm actually ready to send information over and say, hey, I want you to, I want you to process this thing. Inside of my website, I actually have a Razor component, and I believe my Razor component is called checkouts. No, that's not it. Is it this one? Checkout modal, right? So inside of my checkout modal, I have a method here that's called submit checkout. And if you remember what it looked like before, right? All I was doing was that I was getting an instance of HTTP client, right? And I have a named instance called Dapr. And then all I need to do is just call publish. So I call publish, I give it the name, right, of the pub sub, right, the name of the component I want to send it to, and then checkout here is just the key, right? So when I look inside of the message, like that's going to be like the queue that I want to send it to, and all I have to do is just hand it my content, right? So then that's how I publish the message. Well, how do I actually subscribe to the message? So let's take a look at our checkout processor, because this is the thing that's responsible for processing that stuff. And inside of it, I have a controller. There we go. I have a controller called Dapr controller. Now, this is not a controller that's from the framework. This is just one that I just wrote for myself, and I just happened to call it Dapr. And what will happen is that whenever my Dapr sidecar spins up and my associated other app spins up, it'll look and it'll see, hey, do I have a method called subscribe? So actually what this is doing, or what my sidecar is doing, is that let's say, I'm attached to the sidecar. It's going to call this method Dapr.subscribe, right? And then once it calls subscribe, it's going to go ahead, subscribe. It's going to go ahead and it's going to make a GET request. And then inside of here, I'm going to tell it what are all the things that I want to subscribe to. So you can see here, I want to subscribe to the checkout topic, and it's also in the checkout routes, right? So this is the topic, and then this is the route. And so that's saying anytime something comes in on the checkout topic, I want you to send it to my checkout method. And here's my checkout method here at the bottom, as you can see, right? And now this just goes to, I'm just going to put a comment here so you can see what it is. All right, this just goes to /checkout, right? So on my application, once you send an HTTP request over to /checkout, it's going to fire this method, and now I'm going to be able to look inside of the request, pull out some of that data, and now I can start processing. So here on my side, all I'm doing is I'm just doing some basic logging. But you can imagine on your side, you might want to do things like, you might want to kick off an additional workflow. You might want to check out inventory. You might want to look at payment processing. You might want to, call Stripe or one of these APIs. You might want to send out notifications to let them know what's the status of your checkout, and all these other types of things. But this is great, right? But again, notice, just like I said before, and just like my other applications, this knows absolutely nothing about Dapr, right? Again, all it knows about is HTTP, and I'm reading something called a cloud event, which that's a little bit beyond what we're going to talk about today. But cloud events is really just a consistent format for sending and receiving messages, right? So I'm going to look at that cloud event. I'm just going to pull my data out of here, and now I'm going to start processing it. Now, if I head back over to the browser, right? So let's do this. So again, just like I said before, I'm going to click some things. I'm going to check out some things. And then when I come over to RabbitMQ, because RabbitMQ is what I'm using in this instance, right? You'll see that I have this thing called Q Dapr Rabbit Checkout. And I'll be honest with you, I didn't create this, right? The only thing I did was point Dapr to it. And then you'll notice here, I have like this little blip that kind of came up here. That's the sign, or that's like the little monitoring thing inside of RabbitMQ to let me know, well, I actually had a message that came in. But again, my processor already fired up and it took it off, which is great. But again, I didn't create the queue, I didn't create the exchange or any of these types of things. Like Dapr does that for me, which is amazing. And all I have to worry about is like sending the message. Now let's take a look at distributed tracing. Now, if you've never seen one of these traces before, I'm using Zipkin. Again, you could use Azure Monitor in the cloud, or you could use something like Jaeger if you wanted to. But what I could do is I could actually make use of, I think I need to refresh this. There we go. I could actually make use of, I can hit that refresh button really quick. I'll make this a little bit bigger because these, the font on this thing is just a little bit small. But there we go, right? And I could see, I'm trying to get it to move over. There we go. And I could see how my website sends information over to the products API, but then, and then this is happening over HTTP using service invocation. But then here at the bottom, I'm also talking to my checkout processor, which is again listening to that queue in RabbitMQ. And as you can imagine, if I had more services in here, this would be a much bigger diagram and more instances and so on and so forth. But just on this basic level for the simple application, it's really good to see like what are my dependencies, what's talking to what, and how is that actually being controlled. And again, you don't really see the Dapr sidecars in here, but again, that's just one of the benefits that you get from using something like this. So there you have it. The last thing I wanted to show you in here, and I think I mentioned it a little bit, was if you take a look and see what my Redis instance looks like, and I'll click on that really quickly for my state store. So notice how my Redis state store has this thing of secret, right? Well, so again, one of the benefits is that we can make use of some of these external secret stores. So that means that I could do things like, use Key Vault from HashiCorp, if you're familiar with that. I could use Microsoft Vault, or I could, whatever supported Vault provider that you want to use. I could use that, so I don't have to have hard-coded, sensitive information and credentials inside of these manifest files. So again, very Kubernetes-ish, right? Like I have a secret reference, and then I'm just saying, I want you to get the Redis password key. And then notice here at the bottom on line 15, I'm saying, I want you to use the local secret store. And the local secret store, as you can imagine, is just another component that I configured inside of Dapr. So let's take a look and see what that looks like. So here I have one called local secrets, right? And my local secrets is just logging out to a file, right? And here's where the file is actually located. And if I look inside of that file, here you can see, my Redis password. This is my super secret Redis password, so don't steal it or use it because I'll be in trouble. But anyway, this is my Redis password. Now, this secret store in particular, like this local secrets that I'm showing you, this is really here for development. I think there's also an in-memory one and one that also uses environment variables. Yeah, like this particular one that's using this file is really just for development. Probably what you'd want to do as you switch over, because again, remember, all you have to do with Dapr is just change the configuration. Once you come off of your machine from dev mode or QA mode, you probably want to run something that's a little bit more robust. Again, like something like HashiCorp Vault or Azure Key Vault that's on-premise or on the cloud. But for development, this is really handy, right? And I could just very easily come in here and I could just add additional keys and values. Because this is just, this is just a JSON file in plain text. So again, don't use this in production, but in terms of like flexibility for development, it's great. Because now as you change this thing, you decide to use a more robust solution, you don't have to, you don't have to change your code. All you have to do is just change the Dapr configuration. So there you go. Okay. All right. So let's head back over to our slides really quick. So like I mentioned, we just spoke a little bit about secrets. I showed you how to get secrets declaratively, right? So if you notice, like I had a secrets manifest file, and then I had another one that was using that same secrets to pull information for like my, my Redis instance. But if you wanted to, your application can even make a call to that Dapr sidecar, and you can pull information out of that you could use inside of your code as well. And again, as you can see, we could use Kubernetes and Azure Key Vault and all these types of things. But the important part is always, using these building blocks, there's going to be some well-defined contract, there's going to be some well-defined URL path that I could use to interact with these resources, which is very cool. And again, as you can imagine, like we had input bindings, we now have output bindings as well. So not only can I get information and get signal, but I can also push it out to some of these other places as well. My colleague Donovan has a really cool sample that he actually does this with Twitter, where he uses Twitter as an input-output binding. And again, his code knows nothing about Twitter, right? It doesn't have any access keys or tokens or anything like that inside his actual source code. All that stuff just exists inside of the Dapr sidecar. So that's great. Okay. Now, all right. So let's keep going. Oh, and so here's a sample I was talking about, right? So again, we can have that input binding, and then it just talks to the sidecar, and it'll figure itself out. Now, the next thing I want to talk to you about, so Kubernetes. So sure, I've been running my sidecar and I've been running my application so far on localhost and within Docker Compose, and that's fine, and that's a great option for a lot of folks. Again, you could run it on your own infrastructure if you want, and that's also a great option. Dapr has first-class support for being hosted in Kubernetes, and there's a whole collection of operators and things of that nature that once you install the Dapr Helm charts, it'll do a lot of that stuff for you. And now all you have to worry about is again creating those Dapr components like I showed you before. One of the differences that you'll notice is that now when you're in that Kubernetes space, it'll just make use of a lot of those native facilities that are there. So when we talk about service invocation in the beginning, and I was talking about how it was using MDNS and those types of things, well, instead of using MDNS, now it'll just use the internal Kubernetes, core DNS and etcd facilities to figure out where services are. It also can make use of like the Kubernetes key store, secret store, and like tons of other things that are already in the box. And so you don't have to worry about, oh, well, how do I transition from this thing to that thing, or whatever the case is. Dapr supports a lot of that. And again, you don't have to worry about changing your code too much. And again, just as you can imagine, just like I can use the things inside of Kubernetes, I can use the things outside of it too. So again, if I have things that are running in my cloud, if I have things that are running, maybe you're running Kubernetes on premises, which is fine as well. You have the ability to make use of any of these bindings that we have here. So that's what we've seen from Dapr so far. So Dapr, again, like I'm going to quickly summarize. So we have a collection of various types of, building blocks of patterns that we think, a lot of folks that are writing distributed applications, that are writing cloud native applications, that are writing microservices really care about. There's a couple that I didn't really speak about today because I think it kind of goes a little bit beyond the time that I have and also like what we want to talk about. But, there's things like, there's actors and, I know configuration is another thing that's coming up really soon. One of the things that we're also working on in terms of Dapr is that, you can see what I've done here, or at least the samples that I've shown you so far, have really only used HTTP, right? Like I haven't brought in any libraries or frameworks or anything like that. But we do have those and we are working on those. So for folks that might be using things like Flask or Django, or if you're using things like ASP.NET Core, we're working on, various plugins and extension points to some of those web frameworks that you're probably already using. So at least that way it becomes even easier for you to get started. So you have the option, right? Like if I want to just keep it bare bones and then just use HTTP and just make web requests, that's fine. Or if you actually want to go, with a little bit extra abstraction and make use of our client SDKs and our integration into some of these web frameworks, you can do that as well. Some of the things that you could see us coming up with in the future will be integration to some of these other things like, like Azure functions and things of that nature. So like I mentioned before, again, we do have support for actors. A lot of folks really use these a lot, particularly when it comes to that world of IoT. I think for me, like that's one of those places where I see a lot of folks really making use of actor framework type architectures and being able to have state that represents like an instance of like a device or something like that around the web. So we have a lot of folks that are doing that too. Another thing that we do a lot of, or another thing that's really new that I'd really love to get your feedback on this actually, is being able to run workflows within Dapr itself. So for those of you, again, that are familiar with Azure, we have something called Azure Logic Apps. And Logic Apps was always a way for us to visually describe what a workflow would look like, right? So there's a designer, and then there's different steps and components that we can kind of compose together to create a workflow. And now we can have that workflow that will get executed, again, via some trigger that exists externally. But that has always been something that runs in the cloud. One of the things that the Logic Apps folks have done is they've kind of created like a portable runtime for us. So now we can actually embed that Logic Apps runtime inside of our .NET applications because it's actually a .NET, it's a .NET package that we can actually run. And so the Dapr folks are wrapping it now, and they're creating what's essentially Dapr workflows. So I could create my workflow, and there's actually a designer that we could use in Visual Studio Code, or if you feel like you could just write the JSON as well. Some people like to do that. But you can create your workflow, and then now you essentially just reference that file, you give that file to Dapr, and then it'll spin up the workflow engine, and it'll go ahead and start executing your workflow, which I think is really great. And it's good too because not all the time, you don't always want to be connected to the cloud when you do things, and then you always Sometimes you want to have that flexibility. Sometimes I want to be able to move things around, or sometimes I want to just do local dev, or sometimes I want to, have part of my application run in this place and a part running in another place. Using very much of a hybrid approach. So depending on what you're trying to do, like we just want to make sure that we give you flexibility to do that. And so this is kind of what that would look like, right? So again, we can have our input bindings, we can have, our service invocations on the right side that would trigger that workflow. And then internally, we're running like an embedded version of that workflow engine. And all we need to do is just give it a workflow.json. It doesn't need to be called workflow.json. It could be, my app, my thing.json, and then it'll just run the defined workflow that's inside of that. Now, this is still preview. This is not 100% at V1 yet, but we'd definitely love for you to check it out. Let us know what you think about it. How would you use workflows that you could run like outside of the cloud and kind of manage in your own containers and in your own infrastructure? We'd definitely like to know what that looks like. Also, too, like today, it doesn't support all of the triggers and the components. There's a lot of them that are in there, so you definitely like HTTP and tons of other ones that are in there as well. But so all of the components are not in there as you would expect from the hosted version of Logic Apps that runs in the cloud. But again, I think there's a lot of great stuff here. So again, please let us know what you think about it, and then we could keep it going. Now, some of you may or may not know this, but Azure Functions can actually run in containers. So again, you don't have to run Azure Functions, or at least the Azure Function runtime on the cloud in Azure. You can actually bring it into your Kubernetes cluster. You can run it in a container. You can run it locally on your host if you wanted to. And so one of the things that we're doing is that for folks that are using Azure Functions in that way, we're created this Dapr extension for Azure Functions that will allow you to use some of those triggers and bindings. Again, like triggers and bindings is a thing that's very native to Azure Functions if you've never done that before. But you can use some of those triggers and bindings to pull in some of that state information and work with the queues and some of those things that are defined in your Dapr configuration for you to start working with. And I think that's a really great option. So again, it gives you the flexibility of, whatever you need to do or wherever you need to be, again, whether you're running ASP.NET, if you're running functions, you have the ability to, do that as well. Okay. So moving on, so what exactly is on the roadmap for Dapr? What do we have to look forward to? So I mentioned the functions runtime just a little while ago. So, the work is being done to kind of push that to V1. Logic Apps too, we need to work on that as well to push that to V1. I know there's also work being done on, again, configuration extensibility, things like retries and configurable retries and backoffs and things like that for your microservices, being able to give you control for those types of things. Also API management integration is going to be an interesting thing. I'm looking forward to see what that looks like. Essentially, that would be like using a self-hosted version of API management as ingress into your application, and then having that being Dapperized, so to speak, so you can start using that for your different use cases and things of that nature. The last thing I want to tell everyone, definitely I'd recommend that you head over to the Dapr community. There's a lot that has happened since V1 came out, and again, version 1 came out just February of this year, February of 2021, and we've had tons of ebooks that have been released. We have a new Discord community, and there's a lot of conversations and chatter. The team is in there talking about the different SDKs and the extension points. So if you're really interested in just learning what folks are doing and just having conversations directly with the folks that are working on Dapr, I definitely recommend you head over to the Discord, channel. On YouTube, we have plans to create a ton of videos to put on YouTube. There's actually a community, kind of like a community stand-up or a community call that happens semi-regularly. And then so you can come in there and you can kind of see demos and have live conversations with the team as well. And of course, you could always head over to GitHub. GitHub is the source of all truth when it comes to Dapr. And then you can see all the documentation. You could see the actual code. There's a contribs repository if you want to know. Okay, well, hey, I don't really use Azure Service Bus, or I don't really use this component. Do you support like this GCP thing, or SQS or something like that? You can go in there. You could see all of the different state providers. You could see all of the different pub subcomponents. You could see the different secret stores and the different things we support in terms of open telemetry and service discovery and all those types of things. And if there's a component that you would like to have that we don't, well, let us know. That's great too. But for me, I think the benefit and what I really get out of Dapr, what I really love about it, is one, I can run it anywhere. It's free and open source. It has a really good community, and I could use any language that I want. So I'm a .NET person. I write a lot of .NET. I write a little bit of Python. I can integrate my .NET and Python apps without having to worry about doing any marshaling or any crazy information exchange. And I can also do it without having to have any hard dependencies on any external providers, except for Dapr, of course, right? So, again, it makes it a little bit easier for me to write microservices. I hope you see the benefit of it. I hope you try it out. And again, if you have any questions or anything like that, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter and on social media. Feel free to reach out to the team inside of the Discord channel, and just let me know what you think about it. So with that being said, I'm going to stop here. I hope if you all have any questions, let me know. I'm totally open to answer questions for folks, and I hope you all enjoyed the talk.
Yes, Cecil, thanks very much for this talk. I personally love Dapr very much. I think among all cloud native technologies, this is the most promising one, and this could be a really great helper for all the developers, which literally takes all the heavy stuff on its shoulders, and we can focus on business logic rather than all this let's say, surrounding stuff when we build microservices architecture. A question from audience. What about the languages which are not yet supported by Dapr? Is there a chance to just go and add support yourself?
Sure. So that's an interesting question. So we have a few officially supported languages. So Go, .NET, Python, and Java. I believe Java is there as well. We actually had a community member contribute a PHP one because they were doing some WordPress things and they wanted to integrate WordPress and Dapr together. And so they went ahead and they created the Dapr PHP client, and they did it themselves. And obviously the team and the engineering team helped them as well as they went through that process. So one of the things I would say is, hey, if there's something that's not there that you'd like to have, submit an issue, let us know. If you want to work on one yourself, that's fine. But also too, if you're running a language that doesn't have an SDK, but if your language speaks HTTP, you could just make HTTP calls. Again, one of the things I want you to remember from the demos that I showed, I had no Dapr SDK in any of my applications. It was all just calling HTTP, HTTPS endpoints. So if your language is not supported today, you can still try it out and just use HTTP. But again, if that support is important to you, definitely let us know. Come to the Gitter channel, come to GitHub, submit issues, and then we can talk about it.
Yeah, and be like PHP community who created this support themselves. So Dapr is an open source after all, so everyone can contribute. I think this is a really great statement to finalize our session. Thank you, Cecil, very much. And
Sure,
good luck with Dapr, and talk to you later.